All right, this is part 2 of the PowerPoint presentation on the origin of hominins, or identifying members of the human line. This will correlate with Chapter 9 in the Explorations textbook, as well as Chapter 9 in the Essentials textbook, and will correlate with Chapter 14 in the Biological Anthropology Lab Manual. The next few slides are going to talk about the various theories or hypotheses as to why hominins eventually committed to bipedal locomotion over various forms of arboreal locomotion, and eventually transitioned to more of a terrestrial or ground-dwelling lifestyle over a tree-dwelling lifestyle. The first hypothesis we're going to talk about is the savanna hypothesis. So a savanna is essentially a habitat that is predominantly open grassland. So this theory is one of the earlier theories that was developed based upon locomotion in various habitats. We do know, based on climatic data, that around 3 million years ago, the grasslands in Africa were drastically expanding. We know that continental plates were splitting apart, which caused major landscape changes, overall drying, and expansion of the grasslands. So this expansion of the grasslands in Africa would have hypothetically forced early hominins out of the arboreal habitat and onto a savanna habitat. So it was hypothesized that hominins would have predominantly been bipedal to see over tall grasses, to be able to identify food resources and avoid predators. This theory is hotly debated, since we now know that the earliest bipeds, such as Ardipithecus ramidus, and some of the earlier Australopithecines were existing in a much more mosaic or mixed woodland type environment. So we know that the earliest bipeds actually emerged in the mixed woodland rather than on the savanna. This theory may still have some validity if you consider that hominins may have further committed to bipedal locomotion when the savannas expanded. However, it wouldn't have been the original adaptive purpose of switching from quadrupedalism to bipedalism. All right, the next theory we're going to look at is called the patchy forest hypothesis. So this particular hypothesis was predominantly developed by Peter Rodman and Henry McHenry. So this looks at bipedalism arising in regions and areas where forests were becoming more fragmented or patchy, and as a result, these food resources became more scattered. So as forests fragmented, bipedalism freed the hands to pick up food, allowing for both tree and ground food resources to be exploited by these early hominins. When you think about it, that would be insanely adaptive as well. If these early hominins were capable of exploiting tree food resources as well as ground food resources, that only makes them more adaptable. As, say, for example, all of a sudden tree resources were less available, they could rely upon the ground resources, or vice versa. This would have hypothetically also made them better adapted to avoid predators, so they could avoid ground predators by moving in the trees and vice versa. This theory is supported by fossils such as Ardipithecus ramidus that display mosaic anatomy, and they also likely existed in a very mosaic environment. So this mosaic anatomy is matching their habitat, allowing them to locomote in various habitats, various mixed woodland type environments. So this is also supported by Tim White's discovery of very mosaic fossil Ardipithecus ramidus. The next hypothesis we're going to discuss is the thermoregulation hypothesis. This is developed predominantly by Peter Wheeler. This is looking at thermoregulation of quadrupeds versus bipeds. So bipedalism may have been favored to manage body temperature and more effectively stay cool during the heat of the day. Upright body posture would have lifted much of the body up into the slightly cooler zone of air, and it also exposes the bodies to more wind and air, allowing them to cool down more effectively. So this theory is also presuming that these early bipedal hominins were existing predominantly in a savanna-type environment. This one is also debated, since if hypothetically the earliest hominins actually emerged in the mixed woodland, they could have used the trees as shade as well. They wouldn't have necessarily been forced to be exposed to the savanna sun. This theory also looks at essentially if you're bipedal, there's less solar radiation that's going to be hitting your body surface area, whereas if you're a quadruped, you have more solar radiation that's hitting your overall body area. So this is called the thermoregulation hypothesis. Next hypothesis is called the provisioning hypothesis. This hypothesis was developed predominantly by Owen Lovejoy. This hypothesis states that freeing the hands was extremely important in allowing males to assist females in more effectively procuring or provisioning food. So essentially the provisioning of food acted as a form of sexual competition amongst males for access to females. So according to this hypothesis, birth spacing, so if you think back to what we learned with the human adaptation chapter, birth spacing is essentially the amount of time between birth A, birth B, birth C, so on and so forth. So birth spacing would have been reduced since females would have to move around less and would essentially have greater access to food resources. So if they were able to reduce their birth spacing, that would hypothetically increase their individual success as well as their reproductive success. So this particular model is looking at both reproductive factors as well as food gathering factors. Next one is called the postural feeding hypothesis. This one is developed predominantly by Kevin Hunt, and it's looking at the feeding benefits that are associated with bipedalism. And it's also looking at how modern-day apes, such as chimpanzees, bonobos, orangutans, how they're acquiring their food resources while in the trees and in the ground. So if you look at modern-day apes, an upright posture does help them more effectively reach hanging fruit and the small trees that are typical in an African woodland environment. So that again goes along with discoveries of fossils like Ardipithecus ramidus that suggests that bipedalism emerged in the mixed woodland rather than on the savanna. And it also hypothesizes that early hominins became upright to stand on tree branches to collect fruits. So kind of like the image you're seeing here, they're standing upright, they have a bipedal posture in the trees. And you see this image of the hominin here. According to this hypothesis, upright walking on the ground would have come later. That upright walking first emerged in this more arboreal mixed woodland environment. All right, so the next few slides we're going to look at the earliest members of the human line. So depending on what textbook you're looking at, just so you don't get confused, sometimes they call this group of hominins pre-Australopithecines, meaning those that came before the Australopithecines. Sometimes you may see them called just early members of the human line, or you may also see them called basal hominins. So we'll look at three different fossils: Sahelanthropus chigensis, that dates about 6 to 7 million years ago, Orion duganensis, that dates about 6 million years ago, and Ardipithecus ramidus, that dates between 5.8 to about 4.4 million years ago. All right, the first one is Sahelanthropus chigensis. I know a lot of these names are difficult to pronounce. I do encourage you to practice saying them. It is definitely easier to memorize them if you practice saying them. So Sahelanthropus chigensis, this particular fossil was uncovered in Chad in Central Africa. This fossil is very interesting because it's considered to be very close to the split between the pongids and the apes, so basically humans and their split from the other apes. This fossil is dated to about 6 to 7 million years ago. The habitat would have been forested near a lake. Anatomical features, the cranial capacity or the brain size would have been relatively small, right around 350 cubic centimeters, which is right in the range of what you'd see in modern-day chimpanzees and bonobos. Whether or not this particular species was a habitual biped is debated. Those that believe that Sahelanthropus was likely a habitual biped base their evidence on the position of the foramen magnum. So if you remember, that's the hole or the opening where the spinal cord connects to the skull. So the foramen magnum has a much more anterior position, which is typical of what you would see in a biped. Other evidence that this fossil should be considered a hominin on the human line rather than the ape line is the fact that the canine is relatively reduced and it's non-honing. Other ape-like features, the brow ridge is pretty pronounced, but we also see a pretty pronounced brow ridge in many of the Australopithecines, so that doesn't necessarily rule them out from being a hominin. So this one's debated, but this is considered to be the earliest fossil hominin showing evidence for habitual bipedalism. All right, this slide here, you're going to see a lot of these in my PowerPoint presentations. This is basically the same information we just went over, but it's a good summary slide. So this particular slide is just going to give you all the important information that goes along with this particular fossil find. So things like date range, nicknames of the fossil, genus and species name, who discovered it, Michael Burnett, various anatomical features, cranial capacity, and then once we get into the later hominins, genus Homo especially, we'll start learning about behavioral features, tool use, symbolic burials, etc., etc. All right, so this next one that's going along with pre-Australopithecines, also sometimes called basal hominins, is Orion tugenensis. This one was discovered in Tugen Hills in Kenya. This fossil dates back about 6 million years old. Habitat would have been forested. Anatomical features, likely a habitual biped based on the femur. So remember the femur, that's one of those anatomical regions or traits that we can look at to determine whether we're looking at a habitual biped, an occasional biped, or an obligate biped. So we see here in the picture, we've got a full modern human here, and then the Orion fossil compared to a chimp. So based upon the longer neck and also the location of the groove, it's much more likely that Orion was a habitual biped in comparison to what you see with the chimp. Also partially honing canines, likely a tree climber based on anatomical features of the hand bones. So just like the other basal or pre-Australopithecines, we're looking at habitual bipeds, not obligate bipeds. All right, last fossil we're going to look at in this PowerPoint presentation is Ardipithecus ramidus. This fossil was uncovered in the Middle Awash Valley in Ethiopia. The date of this fossil is about 4.4 million years ago, but the range for the species is between 4.4 to 5.8 million years ago. Habitat would have been forested, mixed woodland. Anatomical features, habitual biped, but again, remember this fossil is very mosaic, indicating that they were habitual bipeds, not obligate. So the pelvis, the top half of the pelvis is going to look much more like you would see in a biped. It's more rounded and bowl-shaped. And the bottom half is much more like a quadruped, more narrow and longer. The arms, the overall arms, the humerus and the radius and ulna are going to be longer than you would expect in a typical biped. And the phalanges, the finger bones, are going to be longer and more curved. So indicating that Ardipithecus ramidus retained some abilities for arboreal climbing. The femur is slightly longer and angled inward towards the knee, which is typical of a biped. The hallux, the big toe, is opposable. So that's another one of those more primitive features that would have indicated retention of arboreal climbing. Cranial capacity is relatively small, right around 380 cc's for this particular fossil. So again, within the range of what you'd see in modern-day chimpanzees. Habitual biped, not an obligate, retaining some of those arboreal capabilities. Arms and legs are about of equal length, which is what you would expect more in a quadruped rather than a biped. The opposable hallux, non-honing canines, relatively small cranial capacity. All right, so that's the conclusion of the early members of the human line PowerPoint presentation that correlates with chapters 9 in the Explorations and the Essentials textbook and lab number 14.